Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. This morning brings a little relief for the Prime Minister. Labour's poll lead seems to be falling. Omicron is in retreat and the threat of a leadership challenge is ebbing away. He's made peace with his Chancellor on the national insurance tax rise, and this week looks to be packed with news not featuring parties or cake. A white paper on levelling up, talks with Vladimir Putin, more troops for NATO, a visit to Eastern Europe. Lots of opportunities to look like a statesman. But he's not out of the woods yet. There's still the Sue Gray report to come in some shape or form. And PC Plod may be feeling some collars at number 10, though that could take some time. And perhaps more important than all that, voters will see the money vanishing from their pay packets within weeks. And that's in addition to the looming rise in energy prices. The former Prime Minister David Cameron once described Mr Johnson as a greased piglet who would always magically manage to wriggle free of trouble. Let's see what our guests think. With world leaders focused on potential war in Ukraine, we'll speak to Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who will be flying to the country soon as the UK considers doubling the number of troops committed to NATO defence. She's also responsible for negotiating with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol. We're expecting the government to finally publish its plans for levelling up this week, so we'll talk to Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy. We'll also get a view from one of the regions those plans should benefit, with the Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin. Meanwhile, the government's facing a number of challenges at the moment. One of those is from its own backbenchers and supporters over the national insurance rise that's coming in April. I'll speak to Tory MP Robert Halfon. And with Vladimir Putin massing 100,000 troops on the Ukraine border, how would the West really hit him where it hurts if he invades? I'll ask one man who's had his own run-ins with the Russian leader and survived, campaigner and investor Bill Browder. But first, I'm joined by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. Good morning, Foreign Secretary. Do you expect that if we can't find a diplomatic solution to Ukraine, the Ukraine problem, that Russia will either invade and occupy or install a puppet government?
Well, first of all, the number one priority is deterring Vladimir Putin from taking that action. That's why we are offering to deploy extra troops into Estonia. We are providing more air support across the Black Sea, and we're supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine to make sure that they are in the best possible position should Vladimir Putin try to stage an incursion. And what I'll be announcing later this week is improved legislation on sanctions so we can target more Russian interests that are of direct relevance to the Kremlin, because we absolutely need to stop this happening. That is our number one priority. Of course, we'll use diplomacy. I'm travelling to Ukraine this week. I'll be travelling to Moscow next week. However, the number one thing that will stop Vladimir Putin taking action is if he understands the costs of that action. This could result in a quagmire, and he should be well aware of that.
Well, let's take those steps one by one. First the military and then the economic. I'm no defence expert, but any armed conflict is going to be in Ukraine, and we already have a small number of personnel there. Why are we sending troops to Estonia?
Well, we already have troops in Estonia, the enhanced forward presence as part of NATO. And what this is about is bolstering our allies in the Baltics. They feel increasingly under threat with Russia's aggressive behaviour on the borders through Belarus, but also directly with the Baltics. So we are supplying further troops, as are our NATO allies. We're also strengthening around the Black Sea as well. So this is about making sure that we bolster our NATO allies, who we have direct commitments to, as well as supplying those defensive weapons into Ukraine to make it much harder for the Russians to think it's an easy target. Yeah,
but the total in Estonia will be 1,800 troops now. Putin has 100,000 on the Ukraine border. That force in Estonia is a pretty small bolster, isn't it? I mean, he's not going to take that seriously.
But this is part of a work with NATO overall. So our American, our Canadian, our French allies are all putting further forces to strengthen NATO's eastern flank, and that's important. And the point I would make about the threat from Vladimir Putin is it's on the border of Ukraine. The Ukrainians will fight hard. They are not going to give up easily, and this could well result into a quagmire, like the Russians saw in Afghanistan or Chechnya. So this is not going to be simple for Russia. We need to make sure that that's the case.
Well, let's think about how the quagmire, as you put it, gets created. Will we, as a country, support a Ukraine resistance force if they are invaded? Will we send them money? Will we send them weapons? Does Vladimir Putin need to know that we may not put boots on the ground, but we will supply and support and fund a resistance movement that will make life difficult for him for years?
We're ruling absolutely nothing out. So we're already supporting in areas like cyber, in areas like intelligence. So recently we released intelligence that showed that Vladimir Putin was seeking to install a puppet government in Kiev. We're working on other areas of support. I mentioned the defensive weapons. We've trained up 20,000 Ukrainian troops. So we will look at every option, and we will work with our NATO allies to support the Ukrainians and support freedom and democracy.
And that includes providing money and arms to make any Russian occupation of Ukraine as difficult and, frankly, impossible as Chechnya was for Russia.
We are already supplying defensive weapons to the Ukrainians, and we are supplying training and the skills that they need to be able to resist any Russian invasion.
All right, let's talk about the economic sanctions. I noticed that you said that you plan to bring in new legislation. As far as I understood it, we thought we had the powers to be able to do what was necessary. What will be new about the economic sanctions beyond the Magnitsky-type sanctions that have been applied before? What have you got in mind?
So currently the economic sanctions are fairly narrowly drawn. So we could only target companies with a direct involvement in destabilising Ukraine. What we are looking to do is widen that, so any company of interest to the Kremlin and the regime in Russia would be able to be targeted. So there will be nowhere to hide for Putin's oligarchs, for Russian companies involved in propping up the Russian state. That's what we are looking at doing this week.
Would that include, for example, the capacity to seize property, which may not be very far from where we're sitting here, which is worth hundreds of millions of pounds, in the hands of Putin's oligarch pals who've put their money into London property?
Nothing is off the table, and we're not going to go into details of exactly who and how we would target the sanctions. What the legislation enables us to do is hit a much wider variety of targets, so there can be nobody who thinks that they will be immune to those sanctions.
So the message to Mr. Putin and his friends is, wherever you've got the money, wherever you've stashed it, we're coming after it.
Absolutely. And we are working very closely with our allies, including the US, including the Europeans, to make sure that that is a severe package of sanctions, so the Russian government understand that they will be hard hit in the event of an incursion. This is going to be very, very difficult for Russia. And we are working on deterrence at the same time as diplomacy, persuading Russia to desist from amassing troops on the border, persuading them to move backwards.
I don't want to seem obsessed with the property, other people's property, but we've said a lot of this before, after the Salisbury poisoning, for example, and so on. And it seems that we haven't really done very much to hurt the people who have got all those big houses in Belgravia or who have large deposits in London banks. Is the problem here that, in truth, you might say you want to do this, but the cost of it to this country is dramatic. For every Russian oligarch whose accounts are frozen, that means that somebody isn't going to get investment from that Russian money in this country, for example, to support the levelling up agenda. Is that the problem, that it's going to cost us to do this?
We have seized over £1 billion worth of assets, and we have put sanctions in place on specific individuals. But what I'm saying, Trevor, is we want to do more. Want to do more, and that is why we are legislating to broaden our sanctions. And fundamentally, the most important thing is defending freedom and democracy, and that is more important than immediate financial issues. And that is true not just for the United Kingdom, but also for our friends in Germany, who are now taking a much tougher line on Nord Stream 2. You know, we cannot favour short-term economic interests over the long-term survival of freedom and democracy in Europe. That's the tough decision all of us have got to make.
OK, if it's that important, are you going to tell the Germans it's time to cancel Nord Stream 2? Yes or no?
Well, the Germans, Olaf Scholz, has said that it'd be very difficult for Nord Stream 2 to go ahead in the event of a Russian incursion. So we have seen a toughening of the Germans' position on that. I had a good call this week with the German foreign minister.
And we're supporting that.
Absolutely.
Britain's view is, if there's an invasion, Nord Stream 2 stops.
Completely. And one of the issues we have is European dependence on Russian gas. In the same way as we're seeing economic dependence grow on China, and we're seeing increased use of economic coercion by China, we are seeing Russia use the fact that it is supplying gas to much of Europe as an economic tool, and we cannot allow that to happen. And we're aligned with the Germans on that, we're aligned with the Americans on that.
All right, can we go on to the second of your three jobs? You're such a busy cabinet minister, which is Brexit. Elections in Northern Ireland within 100 days. The Democratic Unionists are desperate either for a settlement of the protocol or the triggering of Article 16. Just to get clear, first of all, do you have a date in your mind at which you'd simply stop the clock and invoke Article 16 if there is no agreement on the protocol? How long are you going to allow these negotiations to go on?
The protocol isn't working. I was in Northern Ireland earlier this week looking at what was happening on the ground, and people are struggling to import food and other products from Great Britain. And that can't be right, because we are a single country, we're a single market, and people should be able to get those goods and products from GB into Northern Ireland. So I want to fix the protocol. I think there is a deal to be done. We've had positive discussions with the European Union. Everyone recognises there's a problem. And my priority is protecting peace and stability in Northern Ireland, protecting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So I think, and we are in intensive talks. So I saw Maros Sefcovic on Monday in Brussels. He's coming over this week on Thursday for further talks. And in answer to your question, Trevor, we need to make progress urgently on this. We've got a joint council date the 21st of February, and I want to see significant progress by then.
Oh, so the 21st of February, if it's not happening, then Article 16 swims back into view?
Well, we always retain the ability to use a safeguard if we have to. I think by far the better option is to make progress with the EU, to get a deal, to get those goods flowing, because that's what the people of Northern Ireland want. They want to be treated as part of the UK. They want to be able to access, the parcels. They want their pets to be able to travel freely. They want to be able to get those products in from GB. But yes, if we don't make sufficient progress, we will have to consider using the safeguard mechanism, which is provided for in the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, that's what the safeguard mechanism is there for.
All right, let's come back to, I think, the thing that will be concerning most people in most of the country today. In 6 days' time, every working person is going to be hit with a national insurance contribution increase of 1.25%. That's a 10% rise for most people. In practical terms, for the average household, that is something like £300 a year, or, according to the Office for National Statistics, 6 weeks' shopping at the supermarket. That's going to be followed, we think, by an energy price rise. That's another 600 quid. That's another 12 weeks shopping for poorer households, a lot more. Now, assuming you don't want most of the country to spend a third of the year not eating, where are people going to find that money from?
It is a very difficult situation that we face, and that is faced around the globe on the cost of living, because we are seeing the backwashes of the COVID crisis. We've seen problems with supply chains, problems with the delivery of goods. And the best thing we can do as a government, which is what the Prime Minister is doing, is opening up our economy, helping the economy to grow. That's why we've now got the fastest growing economy in the G7. We're one of the most open countries where people are able to get back to work. We're able to get the economy going. And ultimately, we are going to pay the cost that we generated during the COVID crisis by economic growth. And that's what the Chancellor's focused on. That's what the Prime Minister's focused on. But of course, we do have to pay for the money we spent supporting businesses and supporting people during the COVID crisis. It's not an easy situation to deal with, but I think the public do recognise that we now have higher employment than we had at the start of the COVID crisis, and that really is an achievement.
But we are talking about people in work. And I've got to say, this is quite baffling coming from your government, and particularly from a co-author of a pamphlet which extolled the virtues of free market and low taxes, the revolution wrought by Mrs Thatcher. And this morning, Prime Minister and Chancellor boast that they're Thatcherites. Now, of course, you've had to deal with COVID, but Margaret Thatcher had to deal with a war. She had to deal with riots and regeneration of the inner cities. She had to deal with double-digit inflation throughout the 1980s. She did not impose new taxes. This is not conservatism as you have always told us it should be.
We want to see taxes come down. And the Prime Minister and the Chancellor made that very, very clear.
You've just increased them to the highest level of burden since actually several decades.
The issue is we need to get economic growth up. And we've already made a good start by being one of the first countries to implement the vaccine programme, the booster programme, open up our economy. We're now looking at what more we can do in terms of freedoms that we can exercise now that we've left the European Union, for example, making our regulatory system better, unleashing our financial services industries. But those things take time. And I think the public appreciate that we spent a lot of money during COVID, and we do need to pay that money back.
You must understand why I'm puzzled. You're saying we've got to raise taxes and we're going to rely on growth. That's what the Labour people come in and say. This is not what I expect from you, Liz Truss.
What I'm saying is that we've had to take difficult decisions because of the extraordinary circumstances we face. We are committed to cutting taxes. We are committed to driving up growth. We are committed to using our new regulatory freedoms.
All right. OK, look, we could talk economics all morning, but let's deal with the politics of where we are at the moment. We talked about some very serious issues, Ukraine, energy prices and all the rest of it. But the truth is there's no space in politics right now. For the most part, the political classes and most of the country are thinking, frankly, are waiting for Sue Gray. Isn't your government really paralysed by the fact that you cannot get past the behaviour, the conduct of some people who, in Whitehall, in Number 10, and indeed some of our leading political leaders? This is a problem of your own making, isn't it? And in particular, the Prime Minister's making. I
don't recognise your characterisation of the situation.
It's a characterisation.
I have been spending my time, in Brussels, in Northern Ireland. I'm going to Ukraine. We are working to supply more troops to the borders of the Baltics. We are working to up our sanctions package. We are 100% focused on our day job. Michael Gove is launching his new Levelling Up paper. We are working on the booster programme, which has been incredibly successful. If you ask most people, Trevor, what they want to see is they want to see the economy open up.
They want to see their taxes come down, don't they?
They
and
do,
you're
and
pulling them up.
the way we're going to be able to do that is by getting the economy going. That's the way to bring down taxes.
All right, look, before you go, I imagine that many of our viewers will want me to ask you the obvious question you've been asked several times. You're the longest-serving member of the Cabinet. You're a very senior person. You know, you've got these 3 jobs that you've got to do. I'm not going to ask you the obvious hypothetical question, what happens and so on, but let me ask you this. In the Prime Minister's own words, when it comes to number 10 Downing Street, the keys to number 10 Downing Street, he said, if the ball comes loose at the back of the scrum, it would be a great, great thing to have a crack at. Do you agree?
Well, the Prime Minister is having...
No,
That's what
this is before he was Prime Minister. I'm asking you if you agree.
I'm 100% focused, Trevor, on delivering on the Northern Ireland Protocol, on our foreign policy, which is very important at the moment. We're one of the members of the Permanent Security Council. The UK has a huge role to play. I can assure you that is taking up all of my time and more.
All right, we'll return to rugby on another occasion. Liz Truss, thank you very much indeed. Now, levelling up. We've been hearing that phrase near constantly for many years now. Well, we're finally expecting the white paper that should set out the government's plans and maybe even what it actually means any day now. Meanwhile, the government's announced that 20 places in England, including Wolverhampton and Sheffield, will be the first to get money for regeneration. So let's get Labour's view on that and much more with Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy. Good morning, Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. I nearly called you Shadow Foreign Secretary. Sorry.
Good morning. I've moved, Trevor.
The Prime Minister's visiting Eastern Europe next week. Do you think that the government's doing enough to protect the Ukraine from the depredations of Mr. Putin?
Look, I think the Prime Minister is right to go and visit the region. We've criticised him for not going, and I'm not going to criticise him now for going. This is an incredibly difficult, volatile and serious situation. I think the Defence Secretary is absolutely right to offer support, support around intelligence, support around defensive capability. If I had one disagreement with the government, listening to Liz Truss there, it was that it was quite extraordinary that she, on the one hand, was emphasising the importance of widening the sanctions regime, something we've called for a long time, and working in concert with our allies in order to implement that. It has far more effect on Russia and on President Putin if we stand together in the face of Russian aggression. But just minutes later, she was talking up a row with the EU that the government has been trying to keep going for the last few years. It seems to me these two things are completely contradictory and most of all not in Britain's interests. They're certainly not in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland, but you can see now why this is not in Britain's interests as a whole. The issues around the protocol could be dealt with some creativity and goodwill, and I think the government really ought to reassess the way that it's handled that in the light of this very serious situation that's developing on the border of Ukraine.
So, but broadly speaking, you support what they're doing. Would there be things that you would do in addition?
Yes, we've long called on the government to widen the scope of the Magnitsky sanctions. These are sanctions that apply to individuals, and when the government introduced them, they were watered down.
Forgive me, it sounds from what Liz Truss said that that's actually what they're about to do. Will you be supporting legislation if that's what the effect of that legislation is?
If they do, we've campaigned for it for several years. We pushed the government to do it originally, and I think my understanding was that that was blocked by the Treasury. If the Treasury has finally realised that that was a mistake, of course we will support that. And I think the important message from Britain has to be that we stand united in the face of Russian aggression with NATO and with our allies. We will not allow this to stand, and all political parties should be working to that end.
There is a tricky issue to solve here. There are worries that the Kremlin might put the squeeze on by restricting gas exports to Europe, and a third of Europe's gas comes from Russia. Market prices are already incredibly high. They're going to go up again. We're going to face our own problems. Do you think the UK can actually afford to do what is necessary? For example, Liz Truss more or less said, if there's an invasion, that we should put a stop to Nord Stream 2. Do you think we can afford to do that?
Well, I think there's two things. The first is that we've got to work very closely with countries like Germany that are much more heavily reliant on imports of gas from places like Russia, to make sure that we're all working together around this. And I agree with Liz Truss that economic expediency cannot come before security and the defence of the United Kingdom and the defence of democracy. But, you know, for over a decade now, we've had this very, very confused energy policy that's been pursued by the government. We've lost a lot of our gas storage capability that was given away several years ago. We haven't invested sufficiently in renewables, particularly around solar. The government took the axe to solar a few years ago and removed the subsidies that cut off at the knees an industry that was really thriving and developing, jobs growing at 6 times the rate of the wider economy. I think we're now starting to see the folly of that approach being played out at the border of Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why we've been saying for some time now that not only would investment in renewables and in the energy industry and in helping energy-intensive industries to adapt do a huge favour to many parts of the country that desperately need to see new jobs and investment and good wages in them, but that at the same time, it would help us to cut carbon emissions and reduce our dependence on imports of gas from countries like Russia and Qatar. That's got to be the right approach. And I hope that finally, after a decade of inaction, the government is going to wake up and realise that this is critical to our national security and critical to our future prosperity.
All right, let's, if I may, let me catch up with history and move on from your old job to your current job, which is Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. You praised the government's desire for levelling up, and in places like Grimsby, where you and your leader were this week to look at investment that's taking place in offshore wind power. What do you want to see more of in the Levelling Up White Paper?
Well, look, we welcome the small pots of money that have been announced for 20 places today. That's a small refund on the amount that we've lost since the Prime Minister took office. And I think those 20 places will be glad to have any penny back that they can get, because any penny counts. But I think there is a profound sense that the government has really missed the point with the very small beer that they've given us this morning. They've got to get money back into people's pockets. Right across this country, town centres are not thriving. High streets are falling apart because not only have we seen good wages, good jobs depart from many parts of the country over recent decades, it's been turbocharged in the last 10 years. And right now, energy bills are going up, shopping prices are sky high, and people are about to face a tax hike. Michael Gove talks about King's Cross-style regeneration. But if you want King's Cross-style regeneration, you've got to put money back into people's pockets so that they can spend. You've got to get those good jobs back in. King's Cross cost $3 billion to redevelop. The government stake alone was worth 3 times what they're giving to the entire rest of the country with this money that's been recycled from the budget. These are places that within living memory powered this country, places like Grimsby, places like Wigan.
Yes.
And we deserve the right to make that contribution again. We are ambitious for this country. Why isn't the government?
Oh, yes, but I'd like to ask you, Lisa Nandy, what would you do? I mean, when you talked about levelling up this week, and previously you've got particular interest in the position of towns. One of the things that you've said is that you don't want people to have to get out to get on, that they don't have to leave where they've grown up and live in order to get good jobs, to be socially mobile and so on. How do you want to achieve that, and what's it going to cost?
So we want young people to have choices and chances, and we've already made a significant commitment from a future Labour government as to what that would mean. £28 billion investment every year for the life of the next Parliament in green energy. That means the sort of jobs and apprenticeships that I saw in Grimsby with Keir Starmer last week, the sort of chances and choices for young people that are too often denied to them. Unless we take that seriously, unless we get that investment back into places, the transport infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, so that we can leverage in private sector investment, it's businesses in Grimsby that have been driving that improvement and getting that investment into Grimsby and those opportunities back again. Unless we do that, unless we rebuild the foundations of our local economies and allow people the chance not just to have jobs but good jobs again that make a contribution, we will have profoundly missed the point. That's what is so disappointing about the government's announcement today. We've got to be far more ambitious than that.
Yes, you've been saying for a couple of weeks now that the whole Partygate saga and so on has been distracting the government. 2 weeks ago, you said the Prime Minister's position was untenable. But he's still there. The delay around the Sue Gray report and the Met's launching its own investigation probably mean that actually that's going to be the situation for some time, possibly for months. Has Labour missed its shot at the Prime Minister?
Look, the Prime Minister could end this circus today. He could just be honest about what has been going on.
You and I know he's not going to. You and I know he's not going to. Your job as opposition, as the way you describe it, is to get rid of him. Have you missed the opportunity? Did you fumble the ball?
Well, look, in the end, it's up to two groups of people. Tory MPs who could, if they wanted to, trigger for the Prime Minister to go or back a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. But I think it's unlikely.
A vote of no confidence moved by the Labour Party?
It will move by the Labour Party if Tory MPs will support it. There's no point in just perpetuating the circus. People have got real problems. Or it's up to the public. In the end, the Prime Minister, if he stays, will have to face the public in a general election. But just consider for a moment what you said, Trevor. We just agreed and moved on very quickly from the idea that the Prime Minister could put an end to this, be honest and come clean, but he's not going to. That is why this circus is continuing. That is why the country is being held back. That is why this levelling up white paper, frankly, doesn't appear to be worth the paper that it's written on. These promises that have been made to us are not being kept because the Prime Minister is saying that he needs a criminal investigation to tell him whether he was even at a party.
I get it, but it's not my job to make moral judgments about the Prime Minister. What I'm asking you is, if you think it's all so terrible, he's so ghastly, he's making a mess of the country, why haven't you been able to do anything about it? That's the job of opposition. And I'm just asking you whether you think when you had the opportunity, you missed it.
Well, I don't know what you're asking me to do. Do you want me to go down to London now and frog march him out of Downing Street? I mean, in the end, we live in a democracy, and if Tory MPs won't find the backbone and the courage to do the right thing, then it will be up to the British people. What we'll do as the official opposition is leave no stone unturned. We will not rest until people who have been bereaved, people who've lost loved ones, people who made huge sacrifices, have got answers from the Prime Minister about what was going on his watch. And we'll continue to do our job in speaking up for people who are watching these broken promises with utter dismay. People deserve better chances and choices than the ones that are currently on offer to them. They deserve a government that will deal with the cost of living crisis and will actually start to rebuild our great towns and cities right across this country. And until they have one, we simply will not rest. That is our job, and we will do it.
Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for your time this morning. Conservatives generally don't like putting up taxes, but the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have confirmed once again that they're going to be doing just that in April, and in a pretty big way. National insurance will go up by 1.25 percentage points for both employers and employees. That's about a 10% rise for most of us, and is the first time that millions will have experienced an actual cash cut in their take-home pay due to tax. And it's going to take effect just as energy bills soar by as much as 50%, we're told. And all that is making Tory MPs, and probably some ministers too, very nervous. I'm now joined by Conservative MP and Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon. Good morning, Mr Halfon.
Good morning.
Now, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have written a joint article in the newspaper this morning declaring that the rise in national insurance has to go ahead. You have said you don't like it, but have you lost the battle?
Well, I agree with the government that we need the money for the National Health Service and social care. There is an umbilical cord between the British people and the NHS, and they want that money spent. I also agree that we shouldn't borrow to pay for this, because all that does is defer tax rises and also puts pressure on interest rates. What I'm just asking the government to do is to go back to the drawing board and look at how they raise that money. And I've suggested that the government looks at windfall taxes on big business, particularly oil companies, for example, who've been raking it in over the past couple of years, perhaps increase capital gains tax as well, so we can raise those funds for the NHS without hitting low-income workers.
This is very interesting. I mean, if I didn't know that you were a Conservative MP, I would have assumed that that was a Labour MP speaking, because that is precisely what the Labour Party says it wants to do, and precisely what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor said that they'd never do. Well,
I don't think the Labour Party have proposed windfall taxes on oil, but what if you go back to Margaret Thatcher?
Rachel Reeves stood and talked to me and said exactly those words.
Well, that's fine. But if you go back to Margaret Thatcher, and you were talking about Mrs. Thatcher earlier, she imposed windfall taxes on the oil industry. She put taxes on banks because they needed to raise money in extraordinary circumstances. We face emergency circumstances now because of the huge rise in energy bills, up to £2,000. We've got petrol and diesel nearly reaching £1.50 at the pumps. We've got inflation over 5%. So families are facing a real struggle to feed all their families and pay for the cost of clothing, and the cost of living is a huge problem at the moment.
You can understand, Mr Halfon, why I'm slightly disconcerted this morning. I have the Foreign Secretary coming in and telling me, after she has for many years been seen as a tax-cutting, Thatcherite Member of Parliament, you know, the pictures on tanks and all of that, telling me, oh, well, sorry, got to put up taxes. And now you're telling me what the government that you support, which is actually in government and has the ability to do this, should really implement a Labour programme.
I don't accept it's a Labour programme. I'm a practical Conservative. As I said, Mrs Thatcher imposed windfall taxes on the oil industry and put taxes on banks to raise vital funds that were needed during the 1980s. And if I have a choice between taxing low-income workers, so if you're a worker on £20,000, you're going to be paying an extra £90. If you're a worker on £30,000, you have to pay an extra £214 with this tax. That's a huge amount of money, especially with costs in energy going up, in petrol and diesel and food and everything else. So a much better option, in my view, would be a windfall tax on big business. So to pay for that, that would pay for the NHS money that is needed without hitting low-income workers.
All right. Well, look, I mean, let's suppose that the Chancellor decided that what he'd written this morning was wrong, having listened to you on this programme. That would be an extraordinary blow to his authority, not to mention the Prime Minister's, were he now to change his mind. You can't possibly expect that to happen, can you?
Well, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister set out their view in the newspapers this morning. I understand that. It is a very difficult financial situation. All I can do as a backbench MP, represent my constituents in Harlow, is try and campaign to cut the cost of living, because, as I've mentioned, they are struggling to feed their families. And I get emails every day from people who cannot afford their energy bills as it is. There are going to go up potentially to £2,000 a year. That's going to be unaffordable. And we've got another pot of money. The government have cut overseas aid. That's a separate argument that people will make, whether it was the right or wrong decision, but that has raised £4 billion. We should use that £4 billion to cut taxes or cut VAT for the lower paid.
Let's talk a bit about the politics of this. Let's suppose that the tax rise does go ahead. How seriously do you think that will affect the Conservatives' electoral support? Do you think that's really that will be an issue?
Well, of course, people are struggling with the cost of living. So if they can't afford to pay their bills, they're hardly going to be very positive towards the government. So it depends what the government does in other measures to try and mitigate against that. We're told we're going to have a cost of living package in February. I hope very much that that takes place, and I'll look forward to see what the government is proposing. But it has to be urgent action because people are struggling, as I say, to pay their bills.
The other aspect of what the public may be thinking about in relation to politics this weekend, and you may have heard this from your constituents, is, of course, what various people in government and in Whitehall did during COVID. You actually, as I understand it, had to shield at various points during the pandemic. How do you feel looking at those pictures, hearing the account of those parties and knowing what you had to do about what was going on in government while you were shielding?
Well, yes, because I have born with cerebral palsy and other problems, I did have to shield. But my constituents, Harlow, many people across the country had it much worse off than me, and they suffered terribly by not being able to see their relatives or people, sadly passing away and not being able to see their loved ones as they were dying. So we all feel hugely let down by what has gone on. It shouldn't have happened. I had constituents talking to me about it only yesterday in Harlow, how upset they were as to what had happened in Downing Street. And what I've called for is for 3 R's from the Prime Minister, for him to respond to the anguish of the public, to take responsibility for what has happened and to reset the government and focus on the genuine people's priorities, like what we've just been talking about.
Robert Halfon, isn't there a 4R possibly there, which is resign?
I'm not agitating against the Prime Minister. I'm certainly not putting a no confidence motion for 2 reasons. First of all, I don't think the public would welcome bloodletting or change of government in the midst of a crisis in terms of Eastern Europe, in terms of the economy and the cost of living coming out of COVID. And secondly, I do accept that I owe the Prime Minister some residual loyalty, not just for winning the 2019 election and for Brexit, but also for the vaccine programme, for the jobs miracle we've got in our country. And I think those are important things to remember. But that doesn't mean, as I say, I don't want I want the Prime Minister to take responsibility to reset the government and respond properly to the public.
Thank you, Robert Halfon, and I will take the phrase residual loyalty with some seriousness. We no doubt will talk about this again. Now, back to levelling up. It's an extremely important concept for a government that used it to win seats in Northern Labour heartland and for the communities that hope to benefit from increased investment. Well, what does it mean? And will communities that felt left behind really feel a difference? Well, we should know more very soon. So let's speak to the Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us. Now, the government's expected to publish this long-delayed white paper on levelling up next week. Do you expect it to deliver what you have said that you wanted and help to bring an end to the north-south divide?
Well, thank you for having me on, Trevor. And certainly the government seemed to have acknowledged the issue around levelling up, that we need to rebalance the economy across the UK and ensure that health and wealth and opportunity is shared. And new money is always welcome, but after decades of underfunding, the question will always be, is this going to be enough? Now, of course, we don't have the detail, but it does seem to be a focus on affordable housing, which I'm really pleased to see. As someone who grew up in social housing, I know what a secure tenancy can do to enable you to fulfil your potential. But it has to be about more than that. It has to be about skills. When 50% of the working population don't have digital skills, it has to be about climate change. When businesses are washed away every 2 years by flooding, you can't level up that community. And culture, you shouldn't have to leave your community to go to London to fulfil your dreams. And finally, it has to be about transport and connectivity. I've been on your programme before, Trevor, talking about our disappointment on the integrated rail plan, and now we have a crisis in our bus network. That lack of clarity from government about how much money and if they're going to give any money to the bus companies after March has meant that bus companies are cutting routes in exactly the places that need levelling up, like the 5 towns in Wakefield. So it does feel like every single department has to work together. It cannot just be about one person in cabinet making these decisions. We need everybody to pull together, and unfortunately we haven't seen that from the Treasury as yet.
I want to come back to the issue of buses in a second, but just before we go on to that, indeed, the last time we spoke, it was before the announcement on HS2. And you told me that what you really wanted was a station in Bradford. A few days later, the government announced its plans and there will be no new station in Bradford. There is an issue of trust here, isn't there? Because at that time, I think you had you thought that the government might be on the same page as you. They clearly weren't. What makes you think that you can trust them now?
Well, you're absolutely right. We were poorly served with the integrated rail plan. The 96 billion that government announced, it turns out that 7 billion is for West Yorkshire, 6 billion goes for the Trans-Pennine upgrade, which is the electrification of that line between Manchester and Leeds, which leaves us the grand sum of £1 billion, which is for electrification between Leeds and Bradford, and sadly a survey on how we can get faster trains from Sheffield to Leeds. So disappointing, and when I pressed government to give us the detail of where they were making these decisions, it seems that government and Treasury are just thinking about cost. And this is why I'm saying that people and departments need to work together, because the idea of levelling up wasn't factored in. It wasn't factored in about the opportunity for the people of Bradford to have a new station and what that would impact and the money and investment that would bring. You see that in the Midlands, that just the pure announcement of the new stations and the new rail network, that brings investment. That wasn't in the equation when government were looking at what they would do with the integrated rail plan. So I will continue to press the case, but yes, it was incredibly disappointing.
Let's pick up a couple of the points you've mentioned this morning. First of all, on buses, how serious will it be, do you think, if you don't get the services that I understand some of them that cut in half in some parts of your area? What impact is that going to have, and how serious, how big a deal is it for you?
It's a massive deal. If you live in a community that doesn't have a railway station, you absolutely need the bus network. And that's why when I stood to be the Mayor of West Yorkshire, I stood on a manifesto of improving our bus offer. We've allocated £1 million to investigate public control, because we know that at the moment, a bus network that works for profit, this is where you end up when the government and the bottom line doesn't work and government don't support you, then sadly sadly, you're starting to make cuts to that service. So we're getting people approaching us, telling us that if that bus network, if that route ends, they're going to have to walk to work. We heard a couple of months ago of a group of workers who the only way they could get to work economically to make it work, because there was no bus route, was all of them to go in one car and one of their colleagues to travel in the boot. This is not good enough. This is not the West Yorkshire I want to see. We need a proper bus network. And if you're not going to fund us on the trains, please, when we have our bus service improvement plan, I've been saying to government, we need the money. We have a transformational offer for government. You can't then ensure that the money that we are allocating for bus transformation is actually about then managing decline of the bus network.
Crikey, that's a heck of a story about, you know, somebody being in a boot. But do you agree with your Manchester mayoral colleague, Andy Burnham, that key to this is not just the number of services, but their cost? And he's been pressing the case that in London you can essentially have a single bus journey for £1.55, whereas in your part of the country it is far more expensive. Would you put that subsidy for fares as a priority, for example, over fresh services?
Well, I would suggest we shouldn't have to choose. Obviously, London doesn't have to choose whether they get the service or they get the fares. It is part of a complete package. A fare, tap-in, tap-out, capped fare, green buses and routes where you need to get to that serve colleges, workplaces and so on. But of course, it's also about affordability. We have seen the cost of living crisis. Your other guests spoke about that quite eloquently, that the public are going to have less money in their pockets. And if you use the buses on a number of trips, you are paying more, because it's not capped, than those people who just use one bus to get to work and back. So my plan is to cap the fare at £5.50, and we're working with bus companies already. We're not sat on our hands waiting for government. We're already working with bus companies to try and make that happen. It's fair, it's equitable, and it will mean that more people have access to the bus.
Tracy Brabin, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We started this programme talking about Ukraine, and let's finish by doing just that. It's incredibly important and extraordinarily consequential subject as the great powers of the West square up to Vladimir Putin. Bill Browder has had his own battles with the Russian leader, which led to new laws enabling targeted sanctions to seize money from individuals, as we heard from the Foreign Secretary earlier. He thinks taking that approach against Putin himself is the only way really to hurt him, especially with so much Russian money in London. Bill Browder joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Browder. What do you think will be the most effective way to deter Vladimir Putin from an invasion of Ukraine?
Vladimir Putin is first and foremost a kleptocrat. He's been in power as a dictator for 20 years. He's stolen an enormous amount of money from the Russian state, from Russian oligarchs, from others in Russia. And that money, he doesn't keep in his own name. He keeps in the name of trustees. I call them oligarch trustees. And those oligarch trustees don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West. And as you mentioned, we see it in London, we see it in New York, we see it in south of France. And Putin values that money more than human life. He's killed a lot of people to get that money. And so in my mind, the cleanest, safest, and simplest way of deterring Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine is to go after his money. And there's a piece of legislation in place. It's called the Magnitsky Act. It was named after my lawyer who was killed in Russia, Sergei Magnitsky. And it allows the British government to freeze the assets and ban the visas of people who are involved in high-level corruption and human rights abuse. And so we have a tool, the Magnitsky Act. We actually know who these oligarchs are who hold Putin's assets. We know that they are held in London, and we know that Putin values his money. And so the easy way of doing things for us and a very asymmetric way as far as Putin is concerned, is to freeze the money of a certain number of oligarchs. And I would argue that we should do so before he invades Ukraine, to show that we're serious instead of waiting for him to actually cross the border.
Do you think that some of this has been done already, or is your concern that the money is too important to the UK, you know, the property, the investments and so on, for us to really do this seriously?
Well, it's an interesting question, because on one hand, I've seen, and I think everyone else has seen, that we've been pretty soft on Russia here in the UK in the past. They've committed terrible atrocities using Novichok in Salisbury and polonium in London. The Russians have been sending jets over our, military jets in the over our airspace. They've been doing all sorts of terrible things, and we haven't done much. And the reason we haven't done much in the past is because of all this Russian money sloshing around, and a lot of people close to the center of power benefiting from it. But, and this is a really important but, we're now in a new world where Russia is threatening the stability of peace in Europe. And because all that money is still sloshing around here, it gives us what I would call an enormous amount of leverage. We could potentially punch way above our weight because all that money is here. And if we started to freeze it and seize it, I guarantee you Putin would pay attention.
Yeah, but of course, the other way of looking at this is there's all this money sloshing around. There are a lot of people here benefiting from it. And I don't just mean, fat cats in the city, but I mean, for example, people who might benefit from investment of that cash. Freezing and seizing the oligarchs' money is not a pain-free process for Britain, is it?
Well, I would argue that it's very pain-free in the sense that they can't. That there's no reciprocal measure that they can take against us. So it's not as if we have all of our money in Russia, they have all of their money here, and they could reciprocate. This is something that can be done asymmetrical. So we can do it, and there's no way that they can retaliate against that. And so yes, there are people in the City of London and people in the House of Lords and other places who are beneficiaries of this money, but their interests, these people's interests, are so trumped by the interests of national security that they, if they have anything to say about this, they should just keep their mouths shut at this point, because Putin is threatening the peace and stability of the world.
You mentioned the House of Lords. Now, of course, we all have to be rather careful about what we say about individuals and so on. But is your point that you think that people in politics, including in our legislature, are benefiting from the money held by Mr. Putin's associates?
There's no question that that's the case. I've seen it firsthand. Members of the House of Lords from both major political parties were taking money from Russians specifically to target the weakening of sanctions and the weakening of Magnitsky sanctions. And so I've seen it with my own eyes, and that's just a tip of the iceberg. So yes, there are many people here who do take Russian money, but at this point in time, anyone who's taken Russian money should recuse themselves from the conversation about what to do about Putin going forward, because we're now facing such a dire and dangerous situation.
Liz Truss talked this morning about new legislation to allow the government to take action against Putin associates, whether or not they were directly involved in some way in the Ukraine situation. Do you think that's necessary and a good thing?
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and it's really that's the key point. I don't think they actually need new legislation. The existing legislation allows them to do that, but if they want new legislation, so be it, and God bless them for doing that. The key is to go after these people, because this is where our leverage is, and so I'm very heartened to hear her say that, and let's hope that this thing, the legislation, gets put in place, and more importantly, that it actually gets used properly. Because the big problem with these situations is governments all over the world always want to be seen to be doing the right thing, but often are scared to do the right thing. To really do the right thing, one has to make a list of the top 50 oligarchs who are looking after Putin's money, and then start to sanction them. And everybody who's involved in that knows how angry Putin will get, and they're kind of scared of making him angry, but this is the one thing that he'll listen to.
You mentioned earlier on in this conversation your lawyer and I think your friend, Sergei Magnitsky, who was killed in 2009. The sanctions against Russia bear his name, but Mr. Putin is still where he is. He still seems all-powerful. How do you feel about the fact that somehow nothing seems to be able to shift this guy?
Well, it's very frustrating to watch Putin carrying on, just getting stronger and stronger. And it's also frustrating that having passed the Magnitsky Act in the UK and actually in 33 other countries is not more readily used, because we know that this works, and we know it works because Putin got so furious about it when it first was passed in the United States and in other countries. In the United States, after it was passed, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families and made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And he's been following me all around the world, trying to do whatever he can to stop the Magnitsky Act from being passed. He sent one of his emissaries to Trump Tower shortly before Donald Trump was elected, trying to get the Magnitsky Act repealed. And so we know that this is something he cares about. Everybody who's involved in Russian opposition, in Russian politics, who aren't there, understand that this is the tool to get him. This is Putin's Achilles heel. This is what he really cares about. And so it's really a question of using this tool now instead of just having it. And if we use it properly, and if we use it against these oligarchs, it will stop him.
Bill Browder, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
That's it from this part of the show this morning. I'm still slightly recovering from Tracy Brabin's story about being in a boot rather than taking a bus, and also the question of Conservatives defending the rises in taxes. Big morning. In a minute, I'm going to hear from Sam Coates in The Take why that happens.